Okay, this question is question 3 in the packet. It's number 1 on the 2014 AP exam, if you would like to follow along. Again, turn up the resolution if you can't read what it says, and you might not even need to pull up the document at all. So the first question asked you to find 2 different proportions. So this was using the two-way tables. It was pretty basic. I say that. I hope I got it right. 24/33, that's correct. That's reduced correctly. So I didn't get the decimal, but I did get the fraction, and that should be fine. And 37/67. Let's check to see what you needed for part A. Essentially correct if the response correctly performs both calculations with work shown. So this would be considered work shown, and the fraction or the decimal answer should be fine. Part B was a little different. I hope I did it correctly. They asked you to find, or they asked you to write a few sentences summarizing what the graph reveals about the association between residential status and the level of participation in extracurricular activities amongst the 100 students in the sample. So I said the percent of on-campus students participating in one extracurricular activity is higher than off-campus, and the percent of on-campus students participating in no activity is lower than off-campus. There isn't a significant difference between the two groups when it comes to participating in 2+ activities. So this part was essentially correct. I forgot to look at partial. If you have one of the 2 calculations correct, that was a partially correct. Or if you got the correct decimal, but you didn't actually show the work as how to get your answer, that was a partially correct. Or if you did exactly 1 rather than at least 1, that was also partially correct. Yep, and it confirms here answers reported as fractions rather than decimals are acceptable. For part B, let's see what they said. They said pretty much the same thing. They had numbers in there. Let's see if we needed numbers or not. Essentially correct if the response correctly compares proportions between the 2 groups of students for at least 2 of the 3 proportions. So I referred to the percentage, which is the same thing as referring to the proportions. A response without any reference to percentages or proportions is scored at most a P. For example, if you're comparing the counts, because if you look back at the original table, we didn't have the same amount from each group. So you shouldn't be comparing how many. Instead, you should be comparing. So you can see here they all have different amounts. So we're comparing the percentages. We're not comparing the actual numbers. So you should have said something about percent or proportions. But it doesn't say specific percents or proportions. So you had to compare all 3. So the percent blah, blah, of one extracurricular activity is higher for on-campus than off. So here I have the 1. Percent of on-campus students participating in no activities is lower than off. And then there isn't a significant difference between the 2 groups when it comes to participating in 2+. So you just needed a comparison of all 3 proportions. If you have a comparison of all 3, it's an E. Partially correct if you did 2 of the 3. That's not what it says. Partially correct if the response correctly lists proportions for at least 2 of the 3, but don't explicitly compare. So if you just stated what the proportions were without any comparison, that was partial. Oh, you actually only needed 2 of the 3 categories. So I had all 3, but you actually only had to have 2 to get credit, to get essentially correct. If you only compared one of them, that was a partially correct. Okay, I think that pretty much covers it. Now, the real reason I chose this question was because of part C. I'm trying to show you multiple questions where you're comparing the distribution, or where it's multi-unit, where it's covering more than one unit. And I really liked this one because I feel like this question came from Unit 4. This question kind of came from Unit 1, like a little bit Unit 4, but a lot Unit 1. And then this, well, technically it's Unit 8, but it's also what we covered in Unit 7 and Unit 6. So we should be writing a conclusion statement, which we should all know how to do, but I really liked that this question had a lot of different units in it. Since the p-value is greater than 0.05, we fail to reject HO. There's not sufficient evidence to say that there is an association between residential status and level of participation in extracurricular activities. So essentially correct if the response states a correct conclusion in context of the study and provides correct justification / decision of the conclusion based on a linkage to the p-value. So here's my, since this, there's my linkage to the p-value. Here's my decision. And here's like my actual conclusion. There's not sufficient evidence to say that there is an association with my context. So you couldn't just say p-value is greater than alpha unless you stated what alpha was. You could say the p-value is sufficiently large, but you have to somehow indicate what the p-value, that the p-value is greater than a certain number. That's what they're saying here. And hopefully nobody is doing this by now because we've had a lot of practice, but we had to fail to reject HO. We could not accept HO. We failed to reject HO. If you did accept HO in some way, then the most you could get was a partial if you had context and the correct justification. Same breakdown, here it is. Pause the screen if you're not sure. This was an E. Give yourself your overall numerical score.